Chapter 8. The law increases liability for sin after showing to us the detrimental effects of Adam's sin upon all mankind and comparing it with the beneficial effects of Christ's righteous act upon the same people. Paul reminds us that our personal sins then increased the problem. Romans 5:20 says, 20 And the law came in that the transgressions might increase, but where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. He had already set forth the idea that where there is no law, neither is there violation. 4:15. He had already mentioned that until the law sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed when there is no law. 5:13. So now in Rom 5:20 he tells us that the law was given through Moses in order to increase man's liability for sin. From Adam to Moses, Paul says, there was not the same accountability to the law that we find after the law's revelation at Mount Sinai. The laws of God were always present, of course, because the nature and character of God are unchangeable. But something changed with Moses. By their vow, the people bound themselves to obey the law, and the law was established by covenant to be the law of the land. Once they agreed to be obedient, they became accountable to their law. This was not bad, but good, for it was part of a divine plan, much as a parent holds his children more accountable when they have been given certain instructions to obey. But the overall effect of the Mosaic legislation was to increase the transgression. It is not that the law caused men to sin, but that the law made it a crime, sin, when they violated the will of God and went contrary to the mind and character of God. I have heard men say that the law was evil because it caused both sin and liability. Such teachers have told people to have nothing to do with the law, because if you try to obey it, you will be found in sin. That is like trying to lower the murder rate by repealing the laws that make murder a sin. The murder statistics would drop to zero if a nation simply repealed those laws. In fact, if you have no laws at all, the crime rate itself would drop to zero, not because men would stop murdering and stealing, but because it would no longer be a crime to commit such acts. Righteous laws do not actually increase criminal activity, but they do raise the statistics, because those actions are now categorized as crime. The problem is not the law, but men's carnal minds that are not conformed to the will of God. The law is not to be blamed for holding such men accountable for their actions and for restraining sin through judgment. Who among us would desire to live in a lawless society? The law was necessary to establish a viable earthly society among imperfect men. As long as we understand that the law was not meant to perfect men but to restrain imperfect men in their desire to sin, we will understand the purpose of law. If, however, we are so optimistic as to believe that the law in itself can perfect the hearts of men, then we suffer from irrational exuberance, as Alan Greenspan might say, if he were a Bible commentator. Every time a law is passed on earth, it automatically creates a new class of lawbreakers. Laws are what make sin sinful, so as more laws are passed, there is more sin in the land. This is always the case when a bar is raised and the law establishes a higher level of accountability. But one cannot blame the law for men's lawless behavior, unless the law is the product of the minds of imperfect men. If the law truly reflects the mind of God, then it is a proper standard by which justice and sin are measured. Every time a law...
Amen. If the law truly reflects the mind of God, and it does, then a proper standard by which justice and sin are measured. I said that wrong. Then it is a proper standard. Amen.
Amen. If the law truly reflects the mind of God, then it is a proper standard by which justice and sin are measured. So sin increased under Moses, because God defined specific sins at Sinai and held men accountable for violating them. Paul says that this was part of the overall plan of God, in order to show the depths to which man had fallen from the standard of the image of God. On the other hand, it also showed just how much grace would be needed to overcome this sudden increase in liability.
Okay, now that's an interesting point. The law showed how far from God's standard or how corrupt man had become. I've never thought of it that way. It did not just define sin, but it defined the measure and stature, you might say, of the fall.
Liability. At the cross, Jesus paid sin's full penalty, which, because of the law, had swelled to enormous proportions. It was the divine intent not only to pay for the sin of Adam, but also to pay for the sins of the whole world. 1 John 2:2. It was necessary, then, that those sins be fully defined and exposed as transgressions, adding each sin ever committed to the account which Christ would